Welcome back to the next part of the chat app series. In the last part, we took a look at actually loading in our conversations and messages like so. In this part, we're going to continue with sending messages in an existing conversation, and more specifically, the main thing I want to cover now is sending and loading photo messages. So that said, let's jump straight into it. So the first thing before we do either of those things is, in the last video, I mentioned that we need to be caching to user defaults the logged in user's name when they log in. So if you go to the login controller and if you go to the function where we either log in the user via Facebook or Firebase, you'll see we have a line like this, which basically sets the email address to user defaults. We also want to set their name. So over here, we get their first name and last name. And again, this is the version where we log in with Facebook. So we want to set their full name for the key name. And this is going to be first name. Whoops. Looks like Xcode is being difficult again. There it goes. There's that autocomplete I was looking for. First name, a space, and their last name. And we want to do this for Google and Firebase sign-in. And again, the reason we need to do this is whenever we start a new conversation, we want to put the current user who signed in, their name in the database, as well as we're going to need this for creating the user's profile later on. So head to the app delegate where the Google sign-in stuff is handled. And again, here is our cache. So we want to change this to be name. And again, we can interpolate into a string their first name, space, last name. I'm just going to copy and paste this. And the third place we want to put this, and let me make sure the name is correct here, first name, last name, name. Back in login controller, we want to find the other place we have the user sign in, which is in this function right here where we do the validation of email and password. So in the email and password sign in, we can also put that user default here. The only thing that's different about the email password sign in is you'll see we have an error here because we don't know the first name and last name. So what we want to do is from the Firebase database, we want to query out and fetch the person's first name and last name for the current logged in user. So we know that the user can log in because we already have their email address here and we've successfully passed all the guard statements. And we should be using that safe email address. So let's see, we've got this email here. So what we want to do in here now before we continue is the following. So we're going to say self, and actually it should be strong self. So we already have that up here. We're going to say let safe email is going to be our database manager. And we want to get the safe email with the email property that we have up here, which I don't think is the safe one. It is the one we are pulling straight up out of the field. Then we want to go and fetch this user's first name and last name. So we are going to say database manager shared, and we want to get the user's first name and last name. So it looks like we don't actually have a way to do that right now. So let's go to our database manager and let's create a function in here that will allow us to get any data out of the database in a generic way. So I'm going to put an extension here on the database manager, and I'm going to add one function. It'll be a public function, and I'll call it get data for path. And this will be a string. This will be the child path. And it's going to return a completion handler, or rather it's going to have a completion handler, which is an escaping completion handler that takes a results. This will return any in the success case because we don't want to constrain it to the type. And over here, otherwise, we'll return an error. And this whole thing returns void. Now in here, what we can say is self.database.child, and then you can interpolate that path in here. And whoops, what we want to do essentially is observe single event. And we want this first one, which also has the completion. We want to observe the value, and this is a completion handler. So this is going to be snapshot in, and in here we can say guard let value. We want to get the value since that's what we care about. Will be snapshot.value. Else we can return, and if we get the value out, we'll just call success and pass in that value. Otherwise, we'll pass in our database error. So I think it's called database error, and there is an error on here called fail to fetch. So this is basically a generic function where we can pass in any child path, and it'll return if successfully able to fetch in our completion. In the results success case, it'll return that data. And at the call site, we can go ahead and cast it, and looks like this is yelling at me because, why is this yelling at me? Okay, let's see, use of undeclared type string. It's because I clearly can't spell. So let's fix that, make that lowercase. And let's go back to that login manager. And in here we can say shared, and we want to get data for path. And the path we care about is the safe email, since that's the child at which this user's data exists. And this is going to be result in. And we want to make sure we say weak self so we don't cause a memory leak. And we can now say switch on the results. And in the success case, we have the data. In the failure case, we have the error. And I'm going to print in here, fail to read data with error. And of course, in reality, we should handle these errors more gracefully, but for the sake of the series, I'm just going to leave it as that. And the data, we expect this to be a dictionary. So we're going to say guard let user data is going to be data as a dictionary with a string, and the value could be any. Otherwise, we're going to return. And finally, we should be able to get their first name and last name properties out. So we basically have this dictionary now, and it's first name and last name. So let me now say, off of this, we can say, let me put an enter in here. Let first name equals this guy. First name. Last name will be the same thing, so go ahead and copy and paste and fix that indentation. Just Control I. Make this last name, and this should be last name as well. And now that we have both of these out, we could move this user defaults cache set into the success case, hit Command B, and we should be good to go. It looks like we have an error actually. So let's see what we messed up. So first of all, we have an error because we're not using weak self, so we can actually get rid of this. The next thing it's complaining about is we have this as first name and last name, and here we have this as first name and last name. And this is complaining string interpolation produces a debug, so we need to cast both of these as strings. So first name should be a string, and this should be a string as well. Hit Command B again. Looks like we still have an error, and let's see where that error pops up. Well, here's a warning. And it's saying that the first name produces a debug warning. I think that's what it's saying, I'm assuming. Let me actually read it. String interpolation produces a debug description for an optional value. Did you mean to make this explicit? Well, it shouldn't be optional because we're putting it here. So let's see. First name is this, equals user data, first name as string. And why is it complaining on this line? It's complaining here because let cannot appear nested inside. So I definitely have a syntax error in here somewhere, and I see it right here. We should put a comma here and Control I this again, and now everything should work as expected. The warning should go away because we're explicitly unwrapping the element in the user data dictionary, make sure it exists and cast it as a string. So that's how we are going to set the user's name. Go ahead and, whoops, we want this other simulator. Go ahead and hit Command R. We're going to log the user out, and we are going to log them back in to make sure they have their name set. So let it build. There it goes. Hopefully I hit the right simulator. We'll find out in 2 seconds if I did. There it goes. And we're going to want to log this user out once things decide to load, and then we can take a look at sending messages. So sending messages, if you recall, in our chat view controller, we had a function where we check if the conversation is new. Where'd it go? Right here. If the conversation is new, this is how we send the message. And once we have sent the message here in this block, what we want to do if we successfully come back is we want to say self.isNewConversation now is false, because now we know it's no longer a new conversation. We don't want to return to self, reference as self explicitly to cause a memory leak. So go ahead and put weak self like so. Make this optional. And what we want to do is implement this side. And in this function, this is sending a basic text-based message. We're going to say database manager shared, and I think there's a send message on here. So send message to, and we want to provide an email string, and this is going to be self.other user email, which I believe is already a safe email. The message we already created, so the message is this guy up here. So we can actually create the message outside of the if-else since we use it in both cases. None of this should need to change. So pass in the message in here, and the completion will return a Boolean. So results, let me call it success actually. So success in, so if success, we're going to say message sent, else failed to send. And what else do we need? We should probably refresh the user interface if the message was successfully sent, which we'll do in a second. We actually haven't even implemented this function under the hood, so don't worry about that. We're going to do that in a moment. I'm just seeing if there's any other little edge cases to be handled. So we are passing in the other user email directly here, so I can assume that this is already the safe email address. We don't need to explicitly say self here. Let's get rid of that. And to update the user interface, we actually don't need to in this case, if I'm not mistaken, because we already attached a listener all the way up here. I think I just passed it. We just attached a listener in our last video to listen for message changes. So it should automatically update the user interface already. So we already ran the app, and what we wanted to do was log out and log back in. And the reason was so we can have our person's name be cached. So let's go ahead and log in with Facebook again, and hopefully my user is cached so I don't have to sign in again. Perfect. Let's go ahead and log in, and beautiful, we have logged in. And the reason, like I said, that we want to cache that name is if you search the whole project, which is a Command-Shift-F, for the word self in quotes, you'll see in the database manager, we passed in self in this recipient new conversation block where we want to pass in the name of the current user who's starting a new conversation. So up here in the beginning of this function where we unwrap the current email, we want to also unwrap the current name. So I'm going to copy this whole thing, put a comma and a line break, and I'm going to change this to be current name. And in our user defaults, we set it to name. And both of these keys should exist now. And instead of passing the word self explicitly down below, we can pass in current name. And let me actually show you what that looks like now. So if you remember, we had another simulator, and I'm going to guess that it was this one. If we hit Command R, you'll see over there that if it runs, give it a second, I think it's running, maybe not. Looks like we have an error actually. Let's see what the error is. Looks like it's complaining up here. It's saying current name, user defaults value for key as a string, and I totally butchered this because I forgot to put the space in here. Let's try that one more time. Hit Command R. I wish Xcode would build faster. It would make these videos slightly less long, but that's okay. There's our other simulator, and here we see the other user's name appropriately. But in this simulator, you'll notice that we see the word self, which should be my name actually. So also on this simulator, I'm gonna have the user log out, which is Joe's account, and the reason is we want to log back in so their username is saved. So we're gonna say joe@gmail.com and password. Log them back in, and it looks like we didn't log in that time. So let me close and reopen the app. We'll probably have to debug later on why that got messed up. joe@gmail.com and password. There it goes. And we still have self. So what I'm going to do is in the database here, let's get rid of this conversation and create it again. So I'm going to delete the conversation node over there. And then under Joe's user, I am going to also delete the conversation. Make sure that I clicked the right one. Yeah, so delete this conversation a bit. Like that, and I think there's a conversation under, there should be a conversation under my user as well. So let me hit Command R to refresh. And let's see, I've got my first name, last name, Joe's got a first name, last name. Huh, interesting, okay. So let me go ahead and close both of these apps. And we're gonna reopen, and we shouldn't have any conversations on either side, which we don't. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and create a new conversation. So let me run it in the simulator on the right so it can also pick up our latest changes. So give that a second. So these chat apps are interesting to build wherever there's multiple parties involved because we need two simulators. So slightly annoying, but that's okay. So let's search for Joe, and we're gonna find Joe here, and we're gonna send a message and just be like, hey man, how's it going? Here is a long message that you should get on your device, and we're gonna hit send here, and you see the message pops up over here like so. But more importantly, now instead of showing self on the left over here, it actually shows my name appropriately, which is what we expect. So let's work on sending another message after we have sent that one. Notice the conversation popped up over here too, but notice when we sent it, it didn't actually show the first message being sent. So we're gonna fix that as well as now be able to send another message. So let's say replying here, notice nothing happens. So let's do that piece. So again, we're gonna go to the chat view controller, and the first thing we want to do is as follows. So in the function where we actually start sending a message, which is this guy over here, this is called when the send button is clicked, we create a message object. This is what we do for new conversations, and this is what we need to do for existing conversations. We already stubbed it out. It's a function on our database manager where we are sending a message, and we pass in the other user email and the message. What I suspect we also want to pass in is the conversation ID, because what we want to do is a few things. When a new message is sent, of course, we want to put that message into the array of messages for that conversation ID, so we need the conversation ID. And that new message needs to have content, date, which is fine. It needs to have an ID, which is the message ID, which is cool as well. We have that. We'll have is read, and the name is, I believe, the sender, if I'm not mistaken. So name is the sender, Sender email is me. Okay, so name is the recipient actually. So name is Joe Smith. I feel like we hard coded that somewhere in here. So let me search for Joe Smith because the name should be the person who sent the message. So let me see where Joe Smith is coming from. So we have safe email, we have display name is me, which is not what we want. So let me do a project search for Joe Smith because I have a feeling that we possibly hard-coded it somewhere, but apparently not. So the name should be reflective of the sender and not the recipient. So we have sender email. I should have probably called this recipient name if that's what I was going for, but let's leave it as is. Maybe I had a thought process behind it that I can't remember now. But anyways, we want to add the new message into here, and we want to also update the latest message for both users in the conversation. So the latest message, you would need to update the date. Is red would probably still be false, and the message itself. So I think we have all this info. So let's go back to that send button clicked function. And we want to pass in the conversation ID here. So go ahead and add a parameter here so this was 2. So I think that 2 was the email. So if we command click into this, we want to implement this function. And let me get rid of all these line breaks. So the first parameter here that actually was supposed to be the conversation and not the other user email. So instead of passing in other user email here, pass in self.conversation ID, and notice it's a string optional. So we should probably unwrap this beforehand. So we're gonna say guard, let the conversation ID is the conversation ID, otherwise we're gonna return. Now we can pass this in because the parameter type is non-optional. Let's go implement this guy. So as mentioned, we want to do 3 things in here. First thing is going to be add new message to messages. Second is going to be update sender latest message, and then update recipient latest message. And to be clear, the latest message for both the sender and recipient are specific to this conversation key. So pretty simple to append this new message in. We want to first get the current array of messages for this conversation. So we're going to say self.database, and we want to observe single event of type value, and this is going to be snapshot in. And we actually want to observe it off of a child, and the child we care about is this conversation ID / messages, and this should return to us a collection of dictionaries. So we're going to say guard var current messages is a array of string : any, and rather is a array, and we're going to say this is snapshot.value as, and if we don't get this back, we clearly didn't do something right, so we're just going to return, and I think this has a completion handler, which takes a boolean, so we're going to say completion and something failed, so false. Otherwise, we want to append the new message in here, and what I'm going to do is grab the array that we create somewhere up here for the new message. So here's the collection message. I think that's what we want. Let me confirm. So this is where we actually create the new message, I believe, in this function. So I'm going to copy and paste it. I just want to double check. So conversation ID, and it's putting in basically messages. So collection message. So let me copy this whole thing, because this is essentially our new message. And we're going to want actually some of this other stuff from up here too. This is where we're getting the current user's email and all that stuff, as well as the message. We're also getting the date string. So let's copy all of this. Let's go back down to that function we were writing in, which is this one. And basically, let's paste that in right here. So the message data is, or message date is going to be message.date. Message is again that parameter that comes in. Then we get the date string from it. Let's see, why is this complaining? Because this should be the parameter and not the type. So that should correct that. Is it not called message? Oh, I used two M's up here, so let's spell that correctly. That's important. So that's going to be message and its sent date. Then we convert the sent date to a string. Then what we do is we can do a switch statement on the kind. And for the types that we're handling, we're only handling, let's see, this is first message.kind. This should be message.kind. Let's see, why is it complaining? Message.kind. Oh, it's complaining because this we're reusing the variable name up here. So let me actually change the parameter name here to be new message so it doesn't conflict with our other naming. Make that new message, make that new message. And this should all be good to go. We're not handling any of the other types. We will handle photos in a second. And we're grabbing the current user's email from the user defaults. And if we don't have it, we complete and call false. Then we get the current user email by converting that email to the safe email. The collection that we create is including the message's ID, the type, the message itself, the date string, current user email is read as false, and name is name. So name should be for the user that it is being sent to. It appears in our database. I might have flip-flopped that, but let's go with this paradigm in general since we already have it. The name we're going to add as a parameter to our function, and it'll be a string. And we're going to have to update our call site, of course. But now that we have this new message, and I'm going to rename this to be new message entry, we can append it to our current messages. So we can say current messages dot append, and we can pass that guy in. Make sure your guard is a guard var for current messages, so it's mutable. If you do a guard let, obviously it's a constant, so you can't mutate it. The next thing you want to do is update the value at this child, and to reference it in a way where we don't cause a memory leak, add a weak self here. And we're going to guard and unwrap strong self. So guard let strong self will be self, otherwise you are going to return out of here. And then what we can do, once we have appended to this collection, we can say strong self dot all of this stuff, so the same child, and we want to set a value with a completion handler, and the value we want to set is this array of current messages, because now it includes the new message, and this has a completion handler, and the completion handler takes in a error, and we don't care about this. We just want to make sure an error doesn't exist. And I'm going to get rid of these redundant parentheses. And assuming the error is nil, we can call completion true. And we're going to have to extend this. Like I mentioned, we want to do 3 things in here. So we're only doing 1 right now, which is this first one. But for the sake of making sure this works, if an error does exist, clearly something failed. So we're just going to say completion.false. And before you hit Command B, we want to go back to our chat view controller. And in here, we want to update this function since we changed the signature. I believe we call this new message. And I also think we put a name in here. And I'm going to make name equal name. And we're going to unwrap the name. And the name should be this controller's title. And again, that name will be the other user's name. So we're going to say self.title, hit Command B. Things should be compiling now. More importantly, let's hit Command R in both of our simulators, and let's see if we can send a message in an existing conversation. So that's the first simulator. Here's our second simulator. Give it a second to build again. There it goes. And let's open this guy up. Yeah, I still see this issue where the message is behind the nav bar, so we might need to take a look at addressing that at some point. So let's open up the keyboard, and notice the keyboard doesn't pop up here, the soft key as it's called, the software keyboard. So you can select the simulator, go to features, and keyboard I think used to be in here. Maybe it's in IO, that would make more sense. And we want the keyboard, CSE audio, there it is, keyboard, and we want to toggle the software keyboard. And that will pop up the keyboard. So some of you have actually asked in the comments why your keyboard doesn't pop up. That's the reason, because it connects your Mac keyboard. So go ahead and type a new message here. And when we hit this, we should see the message automatically pop up here and here, which we do. And now it's actually a fully real-time app. And I can keep typing a longer message to send, and we can hit send, and there's our new message. Notice it scrolled a little bit, which actually shouldn't have, since there is sufficient room at the moment. But anyways, it's a real-time working app now. We can go back out and we can tap back in, and it should load in all our messages, and it looks like it's still not playing nice about the scroll position. And we'll fix that, but this is pretty great progress in my book. So what we'll do now is let's talk about photo messages. Photo messages are pretty straightforward. We want to do two things. We want to first allow the user to have a button here to attach a photo via the camera roll or take a picture. And then we want to send the photo message. And I guess in theory it's three things, because sending a message has two parts. The first part is upload that photo to Firebase storage, and the second part is make a entry here for a message with that photo kind and the photo URL. So before we do that, let's update the latest message for whenever a message is sent, because our conversation here reflects the first message in the conversation, whereas we wanted to show the most recent. And the way we can do that is simply update the latest message for the user node, conversations, and we want to find that latest message in that conversations collection, where the conversation ID is the one we are working in. So let's see, we have the current email going into this function. I guess we also need to pass in the other user email. So I am going to just pass in this guy. So again, we're going to extend this function with a new parameter, and we're going to say other user email is other user email. And let's go back to the database manager. And once again, we're going to update this function to have another parameter. After conversation, it'll be other user email, and it'll be a string. And we're going to want the current user email as well. So up here, let's just quickly unwrap it. So it'll be guard let current email is going to be user default standard value for key email as a string. Otherwise, we can return, and we can also call completion and pass in false. And this is spelled correctly. Cool. Let me actually make this my email, and we're going to use the current email to do a safe email, which is going to be database manager safe email, passing in my email. So we now have the other user email and the safe email. So once we have inserted this message into our collection of messages down here, and this is the insertion, before we pass true back, we want to do the two updates for the latest messages. And it's pretty straightforward to do both of those as well. The first thing we want to do is get the conversations node for each user. So we are going to say strong self.database.child, and we are going to say current email slash conversations, and we want to observe single event of type value, And again, this is snapshot in. Then we want to unwrap. So we're going to say guard var current user conversations. And it's pretty important to make your variable naming as cognizant and indicative of what it is as possible. I was about to call this value, and I figured I might as well name it correctly. As your code gets bigger and bigger, things just get more and more messy. So make sure you try to at least make an effort to use good naming conventions. But this will be snapshot.value, and our conversation key points to an array of dictionaries. And if we don't have that there, we're going to return and also pass completion back with false. And we absolutely should have it because we're sending a message in a conversation. Now what we want to do is find in the conversation the entry where the conversation ID is this current conversation ID. So we have a key in here just called ID, and this is the array of conversations. And for this one, we want to update the latest message. So we have to do a little bit of searching over here. So we're gonna say, basically, for conversations in current user conversations, where conversations, so we can do it this way, or we can also do it with an if else actually in the for loop, which might be cleaner and cause less issues. So let's do it this way. For conversation and conversations, if let conversation ID is this should be singular for conversation and current user conversations. If this is the ID as a string, and this conversation ID, let's make this current ID actually, and this current ID equals the inbound conversation ID, and this is a parameter that we used up above, conversation. I think we just called it conversation. Let's look at our parameters up here. So the parameter that comes in is simply called conversation. I probably should have named that better, too late. So if it equals this, we want to update the latest message in here. So to update the latest message, it's going to be a dictionary. So this is the conversation we want to update, and we want to update the latest message to point to a dictionary. So let's say updated value, and let's make this updated value up here, and it'll be a dictionary of string any. And let's see what the keys are. So the keys in here are date, is read, and message. So again, in here, we're going to put date. And this is, I believe, going to be date string. It's basically the same thing we used up here. So where's our date? Yeah, we have date string. And it's going to have a message. And this is going to be, I think I just called it message up here. Let's see. We have date, content. Okay, yep, message. And then we had an is read, which will be false. And we now basically update the latest message at that position in conversations. Hit Command B, make sure things are compiling. Looks like they're not, and I bet you it's not because this is immutable. So we're going to say cannot assign through subscript. Conversations is a let constant. So let's see, for conversation in current user conversations. So we want this to be mutable. I don't think I can do if for var conversations. Yeah, I definitely can't do that. So we know once we get to this point what the index is going to be. So we know this current user's conversation is mutable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var position here is going to be, so there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can basically keep track of the position until we find what we want to find, and then after that we can update it with this new updated value for the latest message. That seems a little dirty and hacky to do. So one other way we can do it is we can create a mutable version of this conversation as we're iterating through it. I think I like the position version better for now since it's just simple to do. So every time we iterate in this for loop, we can say position plus equals 1, which is an incrementation of the position. And I guess once we are in this position, we can break out of the for loop because we don't want to continue in the for loop. And we should be at the position now where we can update that conversation's latest message. So I guess what we're going to do now is we're going to create a var target conversation, which is going to be a dictionary. And we'll keep it optional for now. And what we'll say is target conversation is conversation. And it looks like we use the same name for a lot of these things, so we're going to probably have to be careful about that, and hopefully none of this breaks. But once we have that there, we can come out of this for loop, and we can say for the target conversation, go ahead and assign the latest message. And notice this thing was optional here, so put the question mark there, updated value, and now that we have the position, we can say in the current user conversations, the item at this position, its value is target conversation. And this is optional, so this might yell at us because we're trying to assign possibly nil. Yep, like so. So let me unwrap this. Let's just look at this error to see what it's complaining about. So it's saying value of type optional. You can coalesce it. We don't want to coalesce it. We want to make sure it's non-optional. So we're going to say guard let this equals this. Otherwise, we're going to return. And we're also going to call completion and pass in false. And we're going to spell guard correctly. And go ahead and hit Command B. And let's see what other issues we have. So we're saying guard let target conversation is target conversations. This is complaining because we're using the same name again. So we're going to call this final conversation down here. It just wants different names. It's complaining up here now that binary operator equal cannot be applied to operation type of string and string any. So that's what I was afraid of because we use the same name. Let's call this underscore so we can differentiate. So current ID is the conversation. Let's call this conversation dictionary. Conversation dictionary, and if the current ID equals the conversation, which is the parameter conversation ID for this whole function, and if it does, then the target conversation will be conversation dictionary. Hit Command B again, and we should be compiling now. Okay, we are compiling. So that was a bit of a production writing this little bit of code here, but now that we have actually grabbed the current user's conversations and updated the latest message, we can update that whole collection for that user's conversation array. So again, we are going to take this, and we can simply say in here, set value, and the value we want to set is this current user conversations. So set value, and we want the one with the completion handler, which is this one. And the completion handler, we only care about the error underscore in. And we're going to say guard error equals nil, else return and pass back completion of false. Otherwise, we can pass true. Let's move that true in here. And we're going to want to copy this whole thing in 2 seconds for the other user's update. And notice this function has gotten huge, so I would strongly encourage to break this up into multiple functions and clean up redundancy in the code. Right now, I'm just kind of trying to go through it fast so we can get it functional. So go ahead and hit Command R to build and run. And whichever simulator pops up, so it looks like this one. Whoops. Let's go back to this. This is signed into Joe's account. What should happen now is when Joe sends a message, because this simulator has our latest code, the latest message in the array here should update for Joe. So let me close mine, and let me close this conversation. Let me open up Joe's conversations, and you'll see here in the latest message, here's the date, and it was, hey man, how's it going? So let's send a new message on behalf of Joe to myself. So I'm going to say, this is the latest message, and hit send, and it sends it in fact over here. Ignore the simulator, we haven't run our latest code, but if we come back here, this should have this is our latest message in our conversation array, and that should be the only thing changed, this latest message, which in fact it is. So we are in business. So let me copy this whole thing. Let's be careful about the copy and paste. We want everything from here to down here, and all of that will occur in the completion here for the other user. So let me put update latest message for receiving, let's say recipient user, and paste that in here. Now what's going to change? What's going to change is this current user or current email is going to change to other user email and their messages. And let's read through the code to make sure our copy and paste is good. We unwrap this, we call it current user email or conversations. I'm going to change it to other. And let's see, moving on, this update value, this is good to me. So this is redundant, so that's what I was saying. We could probably get rid of this code later. This whole shebang looks good to me. What we want to change is this thing, conversation dictionary. Again, we're going to make sure that we find the conversation where the ID is the current one we are doing updates on. We update the position so we can keep track of it. Once we find it, we assign the latest message in here. We do a unwrap with a guard statement. And then after that, we want to update the value. So again, this is going to be other user email. And current, this should be other user dictionary. We update at that position to the final conversation. And this other user email says conversations. We set that new version of the other user conversation, and in completion we just care about the error. We make sure an error is nil. If it is nil, we can pass back true, otherwise pass back false. Go ahead and get rid of this completion true because we want completion true to occur at the absolute end of everything. Hit Command B to build. Shouldn't have any errors. Perfect. And yeah, let's see how big this function is. I'll probably dedicate a video to cleaning up this code later because this is terrible in terms of organization and modularity of our code. But that said, let's go ahead and hit Command R over here, and let's also hit Command R in our other simulator. And we want to see it in action, updating both. Give it a second. There it goes. So we're going to tap into this conversation, and we're also going to tap into this conversation. And I am going to actually sit on the conversation screen here. And over here, I'm going to send a message. And the thing that's cool is you notice that on the conversation list, this actually updated. So that's part of why we wanted to update the latest message, not only to keep track of the latest message, but also so we can have our conversation view be up to date and also update real time. So now that this is all done, let's talk about photos.